So, good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here with you. Sorry I missed the earlier panel. Um, we'll take this opportunity of the third panel to discuss who's in charge. Now, let me tell you one thing, nobody's going to answer this question. However, let us start with Stefan, please. So, Stefan Laxenring, sorry, I tried. I did my best. It wasn't enough, but he's a senior scientist and the deputy director of the Research Institute of Urban Studies, Urban Management and Governance at Vienna University of Business and Economic, as well as the research associate at the Center for Management Science in Paris. In his research, he focuses on various issues of organizational governance, mainly in urban context. Current projects of his covers the coordination of public sector entities, but also cross-sector collaboration, crisis management, and the role of corporate purpose in tackling societal challenges. Looking forward for your talk.
Many thanks. Being the first speaker after lunch is a tough job, but someone got to do it. Let me join my colleagues in thanking you so much for inviting me. It's a great opportunity, a great group, and I'm enjoying this really, really much. What do I bring with me? What is my ambition to do? I want to tell you a little bit about work in progress that we're doing, about the project that we are doing. We, that is Renate Meyer, our professor of organization studies, Martin Kornberger, our professor of ethics and management, and Nicola Staudinger, who does his PhD with us. And to, in a way, contribute to the variety of different approaches to the theme of this conference. Let me say I'm a business scholar, management scholar, organizational scholar, working on an business school. And my first slide is just to give you an idea of what we are doing. We have an research institute for urban management and governance, which has been established 12 years ago. And the idea is to develop some kind of interdisciplinary perspective of current challenges in management and the governance of cities. And in particular, we try to combine an organization management perspective, which would be mine, with a legal science perspective. There are two research fields which are perhaps interesting to know a little about because they somewhat feed the project that I am going to present. And the first is the governance of public sector organizations. From an organizational perspective, modern cities look like this. There are no monolithic blocks. There is no single administration. There is rather a landscape, an arena populated by all kinds of different municipal organizational actors. And the good question is how this plethora can be managed or governed or orchestrated, to kind of refer to your nice analogy of this morning. And the second research field actually emerged on the way in late 2015 when the phenomenon, the so-called European refugee crisis, took place, and very much took place in Vienna because right in front of our eyes, hundreds of thousands of people flew into the European Union via Vienna within a couple of weeks. So there was something going on, and we tried to understand how the city actually reacted and responded to this happening. So crisis management and the governance of public sector organizations are two research fields that feed the project that I'm going to present. Perhaps a few words about the background of the project. We all know that we live in an era of substantive societal challenges. The literature calls them grand challenges, such as poverty, inequality, health, well-being, energy decarbonization. You all know that. That's the kind of challenges the SDGs try to address. And there are all these crises making up the current polycritical or polycrisis situation. The pandemic, climate crisis, energy crisis, the migration crisis I just mentioned, the geopolitical crisis. So there are a lot of substantive societal challenges. And all these challenges have something in common. They are wicked. I really like this old concept of wicked, not wicked. And one of the characteristics of such wicked problems is that their tackling requires the cooperation of diverse actors. So that they can't be tackled by a single actor. Yeah. So we need cooperation between diverse actors. So this actually puts the relationships between these actors, these interdependent actors, center stage. And all these challenges have something else in common. They manifest at the urban level. So cities actually are the place where these issues, these challenges manifest. And this turns cities also in laboratories for innovative organizational responses. And this is why we found it very interesting to research these responses of cities to these challenges. So our key question is, how do cities respond to these challenges? So what do we have to know about cities? Cities are polycentric, they are polyphone, they're fragmented arenas populated by all kinds of actors. Private actors, private sector actors, such as companies, non-profit organizations, and also public administrative actors. As I said, the administrative apparatus of cities has been decentralized and structurally devolved into landscapes of municipal organizations as a consequence of new public management-inspired reforms of the 1990s and 2000s. So what we know is cities are no integrated actors themselves. They are no integrated actors. So keeping this in mind, what can we say about their capacity to act and respond to the kind of challenges I mentioned? First of all, responses have to be collective. And the ownership for solutions that are effective need to be shared. So we need diverse, different actors that share ownership for such solutions. That means also that the reaction of cities to the challenges that I've mentioned come from interaction between all those actors. And coherent responses on the city level require coordination between all these actors. And what we also know is that command control solutions or one-sided enforcement by authorities is not the answer. It might be part of the answer, but it itself is not the answer. Mm-hmm. So I would say then urban solutions are a matter of governance. And by governance, I mean two-sided coordination between interdependent actors. Governance, two-sided coordination between interdependent actors. So much of a prologue. Now I come to the project, which is called Shared Ownership for Urban Solutions to Current Crisis. And I have to confess, for the purposes of this conference, I slightly changed the title of the project to create better fit. Actually, it was called Governance Gaps. Okay? So the focus of this project is cities' capacity to act and respond to challenges, and to shed light on the conditions of the possibility of effective responses. And actually this focus is a twofold one, and there are two sub-projects here. We have an internal focus where we try to understand the joining up of the different internal administrative municipal actors. So the joining up of domestic actors, if you want, and this we refer to as joined up governance. And the second would be an external focus. Here the question is how coordination between city actors and external actors, such as private firms, for example, works. And to this we refer using the label of collaborative governance, which is quite established in the literature. So the empirical case of the project is Vienna and the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of you know Vienna. Rather large, depends on, depends. City, 2 million inhabitants. What is interesting for the purpose of this project is a particular feature of Vienna, which is very helpful in making an interesting case for publications, is that it features political stability. For the last 100 years, every democratic government in Vienna has been dominated by the Social Democratic Party. Which is kind of reducing kind of noise if you focus on certain certain issues. The city administration itself has a budget of about 17 billion euros, which is quite a lot for a city of 2 million people. in the 1990s and 2000s, a lot of new public management-inspired reforms took place. And what you see here is the network of organizations actually making up the administrative apparatus of Vienna. So this is about 250 separate, legally separate organizations, 100 of them entirely owned by the city, 150 that also have other shareholders, which perform all kinds of services, public utilities, energy provision, public transportation, public and social housing, healthcare. So this is a huge, huge landscape that employs a total of about 100,000 people. And I guess this sounds familiar. 2020, literally overnight, everything changed. COVID came, totally unprecedented, totally new, everything unclear, many crisis plans at hand, no one fitted the situation, what to do. So this is the question. And we tried actually in the midst of the crisis of the pandemic to start the project, to talk with officials, with other key representatives of organizations involved. And that's what we actually are doing until today. First of all, let me focus on the first part of the project, which is about the internal focus, which is about joined-up governance. What we here focused on was actually the crisis management and the crisis management team that the city of Vienna installed. And the idea actually here was, or the main challenge, let me put it that way, was how to integrate this plethora of internal organizational actors. Just to give you 3 examples, the fire guards, they were managing the testing centers for COVID tests. Or there's a separate legal institution that provided expertise for preparing the issuing of directives. Or Vienna runs several international offices in other capitals, so they gained real-time information to prepare their reaction. So how to integrate all these different actors and provide an effective response to the crisis. So here the question is, what we wanted to understand is how the coordination between these different administrative municipal actors actually happened or worked. And the problem was the literature was not very helpful here, because in our field there is hardly any research about the governance of public sector organizations in situations of crisis. In our field means the organization and management literature. And if we leave out the crisis or the societal challenge element, still the governance literature in our field is somewhat stuck in a language game about very abstract and ideal type governance modes that had been imported from political science and economics, hierarchy, market, network, the idea that they are combined, so hybrid governance is another term, or some suggest new modes such as a community, but somewhat this discourse is stuck in this language game. And our idea therefore was to do something else and leave this game and go for a more exploratory approach. And here we build on an idea of my colleague Martin Kornberger, who suggested very practically figures of thought as what did he say? Figurative expressions that convey meaning, relations, and gestalt. The idea was to develop alternative figures of thought, as we call them, that explain how coordination between different administrative actors happen. And to give you an idea how they look like, I put them here. The funny thing is, the first time in my life, this publication is in German that resulted from this, so I had to translate it actually from German to English, which made me actually rearrange them a bit because they make more sense in English that way, I guess. The first one, of course, there was a plan, but it was a completely different plan than we teach at the business school. It was an open plan that actually didn't try to control actions, distributed actions, but rather enable them. So it wasn't about limiting of discretionary freedom, but rather it essentially built on that freedom. There were actually 3 key strategic guidelines given by the city of Vienna. The first one was keep number of deaths at the absolute minimum, avoid lockdowns, and sustain the city's capacity to act. So sustain this capacity. And there were no orders, or there were no regulations in the sense that there was a center telling people the managers of different municipal organizations, do this or do that. Rather, the plan was about defining a structure, what actors come together, what time, what place, and how this interaction happens. Actually, I put the organizational chart of this on the right corner. So the basic idea of this plan was to make people come together in a somewhat in a somewhat organized way. A second example of such a figure of thought, and this is my favorite, I must say, is mastering bureaucracy. Many people think bureaucracy actually hinders effective crisis management, and we found, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, that the opposite is true. I tell you a story. There is one guy, top official, city of Vienna, very experienced guy, veritable bureaucrat, that had this idea of let's do large-scale testing in Vienna. And I don't know if you know, but the city of Vienna was very proud to be world champion in testing. They did about 800,000 PCR tests every day, with providing results in about 8 to 10 hours for everyone. And this guy was the mastermind, and he put together a kind of a consortium of players within the city, different firms that actually could realize this idea. And where is the bureaucracy? Of course, he knew, as a good bureaucrat, the crisis will end someday, and the day after the code of audit will come. So due process, documentation, the process of tendering, which was really, really important and organized totally smoothly, and this was a key element of one of the things Vienna is kind of proud of in the management of the crisis. Institutional architecture, which mainly draws on informal elements that kind of relieve formal elements of coordination. Top executives in the city of Vienna have been there for quite a while. They have been knowing each other for years, if not decades. They have kind of been socialized into the city. They have internalized some kind of ethos or spirit of the city of Vienna. And they share some kind of, one could say perhaps with Fleck, thought style, a common ground of values that orchestrates their activities without explicit coordination taking place. So this is something important. And the last point here is leadership by Haltung. Haltung is a nice German word, containance perhaps, something like that, because that purpose needs to be confirmed by the top leadership, by the mayor, by the city councillors. For example, they didn't like at the beginning the idea of Vienna becoming the world city of testing, but they said, well, if my staff, my people say this is the way to go, this is good, and we trust them, we stand by them, so do it. So this is this Haltung element. So just to give you an idea about this focus of the project. The other focus is the external focus on collaborative governance. And here we have one interesting example, one kind of innovative measure implemented by the city, because the city had the idea of creating an investment company and buying stock of small and medium enterprises that have come into trouble as a result of the pandemic-induced lockdowns, which was kind of an interesting solution. And they did so. This company was established. Vienna, the city, held some of the share, and the rest of the share, the other shareholders, were the leading financial institutions of Austria. And the good question here was, how did this coordination between city administration on the one hand side and these private sector organizations on the other side take place? And again, the problem was literature was not very helpful, because we know actually relatively little about how such collaborations between diverse actors work on the ground. So what executives and officials actually do to bring them about. So here our idea, and this is the PhD thesis of Nikolai. Our idea was to take inspiration from social science, political science, sorry, and research about international diplomacy, international relations, diplomacy. Again, Martin Kornberger, a nice quote, I know it's very small. He wrote, diplomacy actually is something that you have to do if you can't control your vis-a-vis, but you can't ignore it either. You have to do something. So this is management of interdependent relations, right? And our idea was, well, perhaps we should have a look at what professional diplomats do to learn and read differently, or read and understand what the city officials and public executives did. And we tried to reconstruct something we call the diplomatic action, a diplomatic action type, as a set of relational practices that we think are key in collaborative governance. Again, to give you just some flashlights about this. First thing here we observed was that both executives and officials acted as agents of a common cause. So they kind of created a common cause and became representatives of this cause. For example, the CEO of one of the banks started to approach other CEOs and said, join us, become part of this. But the other side is you also have to stand by this common cause internally. So if the CEO said yes, he had to make sure within his own organization that people stood by this idea. Another one was going for what we called going for fast solutions and easy gain to stabilize the collaboration in the beginning. For example, or not for example, story, city councillor, mayor, and CEOs of the big financial institutions pretty much agreed that they wanted to do this to help the companies, because they said it's important for Vienna and it's also important for financial institutions and so forth. And they went public with this idea. No contract signed, no company established, but got applauded for this. And this had a stabilizing effect, actually, of the collaboration, and it continued, right? The third one I want to briefly mention is cultivating relationships with vis-a-vis representatives. And here I always think of this nice text by Hirschman, the table community between private and somewhere located in between the private and the public sphere. People, they went for lunch all the time, you know, and they invited investees for breakfast, and they talked over lunch and breakfast. So this was somehow what we call the cultivating of a kind of personal relationship, right, between these executives and officials. Which leads me to the next, investing personal ties. For example, the city councillor responsible for financial affairs, he went to school together with one of the CEOs, and he called him, and he said, well, I have an issue, I need your help. So they sat together. So what he did was he invested his own personal ties. The directors of the newly created company, they were experienced officials of the city of Vienna with their own network. They knew everybody. They brought that into the collaboration. If an investee company had an issue some department of the city of Vienna could help with, they would be happy to make contact. And the last one, iterative negotiating. Negotiation never ended. And here we say using strategic ambiguity. As I said in the beginning, the CEOs, the city council and the mayor had gone public and said, we do this, and there was no contract, nothing. So this had to be negotiated later by their staff, you know? So, and that was, of course, there was ambiguity, but then the nitty-gritty details became important. Then the plumbing followed the poetry. Yeah. So let me conclude. What I tried to show you is what we want to understand better in our project is the city's capacity to act and respond to societal challenges. And we want to understand the conditions of the possibility for effective responses. How does that relate to the title of our panel, who is in charge? I think a lot, because what we can show is that the ownership for such effective solutions is shared, involves a variety of municipal and other societal actors, that coherent responses require internal and external coordination, and therefore that urban solutions are a matter of governance, both joined up and collaborative, and actually draw on forms, processes, and structures we try to capture by our figures of thought. And second, work more on the ground as kind of a diplomatic action type of relational practices. I hope that you found that interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a property law scholar, I have one issue with your talk, Stefan, which is your use of the word ownership. So we'll talk about that. But let me introduce Dr. Nofar Avni, who's a lecturer at the Geography Department and the Institute of Urban and Regional Studies here at the HBU, and a former Marie Curie Fellow. She earned her PhD at the School of Urban Planning at McGill University in Canada. Her research interests focus on justice and special equity in planning processes, urban regeneration, urban citizenship, planning in the global south, and planning in contested cities. I'm done. Yeah. Anyways, so for your talk, I'll let you give the title. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronit. So I would say that my talk is about the opposite of shared ownership, and we're more at the crisis stage, and the governance gaps issues. I'm going to present a project that I had the privilege to collaborate with the wonderful Dr. Kedar Merav, we all remember from the first episode just this morning of the conference. And our research is about the role of arts and culture in East Jerusalem. And when we started the project, we of course consulted with the vast literature that exists about arts and culture in cities in general. So either literature that deals with the role of arts and culture from the city perspective, so how municipalities use arts and culture to, for example, promote urban regeneration or branding or local economic development, like Noga and Einat wrote about here in Israel and abroad. But also the literature that deals with artivism, for example, and artistic intervention and activism in the city. And we found that actually when we look at Jerusalem and other contested or divided cities, there is not that much literature that exists on this topic, and the literature that we found is actually a bit different than what's going on in Jerusalem also specifically. Because when we look at a lot of the literature that deals with arts and culture, in global cities, ordinary cities, they mostly talk about issues such as gentrification and neoliberalism. And these logics manifest differently, if at all, in the mixed or divided cities. And Jerusalem is even more unique compared to other divided cities such as Nicosia and Mostar and Belfast. And being more unique is not always a good thing. And it's more unique because, of course, the crisis is much deeper here. So when we look at contexts, and I think Merav mentioned it this morning, when we look at, for example, the literature from Ireland or South Africa, they're already at the post-conflict stage, and we're not there yet. So even the literature that we found about other divided cities was not exactly about the same issues and challenges that we discovered. And I think that what I'm going to ask you to think about as I present the case studies and later in the discussion is actually if you can maybe suggest ways, because this is something that we, I think, struggle with at the moment, of things that are actually not only unique about Jerusalem, but maybe challenges and themes that you recognize from your own city or other cities that you've studied. Because I'm sure that even though Jerusalem is unique, maybe it has also some commonalities with other cities, despite the political situation here. So the aim of our study was really to understand how actors in the arts and culture field, how they perceive their own political role and agency and responsibility, even their audience, against the very challenging and difficult reality in which they operate. And it's really important to understand the political context of East Jerusalem to understand the obstacles that they deal with. And I'm not going to present it in depth. I assume that everyone has at least some kind of familiarity with the context, and tomorrow some of you are going to attend a tour and learn more about it. but we will say a few words about it. And we conducted, maybe actually I will go to the, oh, I'm missing a slide here. Okay, so I'm just going to present it. So we did a qualitative studies where we did interviews with different stakeholders and also did site visits and informal and also formal conversations with different stakeholders at different institutions. And I will say maybe, and the interviews were conducted mostly in Hebrew and in English. And I will say perhaps a few words about the elephant in the room, that of course I'm not Palestinian, neither is Merav, so our perspective is of course as outsiders to the field, which has some limitations for sure. It has some advantages, some disadvantages, and we can discuss them more in depth later on, but I find it important to at least state the obvious, because of course it also affects our understanding of the topic. So we actually examined different kinds of institutions, and we did first kind of a preliminary mapping of which different kinds of institutions exist in East Jerusalem. So we have, of course, the more traditional type of galleries and museums and different cultural institutions. We also have some that are independent, so they work independently. They don't receive any, when I say independently, I mean they don't receive any official state funding from Israel or from different Israeli institutions. And we have the institutions that actually work with the municipality or supported by the municipality or other different philanthropic foundations to some degree. And we have also other organizations such as, for example, consulates who may hold some arts and culture events or just more independent initiatives, neighborhood associations, and just private initiatives altogether. And it's important to say a few words about the political context of East Jerusalem, even though I'm not going to explain it in depth. So since the Oslo Agreement and the mid-90s, early 2000s, actually, there has been no institutionalized Palestinian political leadership in East Jerusalem. And that's not a matter of choice, not because Palestinians did not want to have these kinds of institutions, but basically because the State of Israel abolished the existence of these institutions. So that's on the one hand. We have no official political representation on the one hand. But also the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, most of them do not recognize the Israeli municipal institutions that exist in the city. So we're kind of looking at a vacuum of political leadership. And to this day, any attempt of political leadership by the Palestinians is highly suppressed by Israeli authorities. We talked about policing before, so all the different kinds of police you can think of, whether it's the Israeli border police or the regular police, or the security services. So any even attempt to do that can and is being harshly stopped by the government. And of course, beyond that, the Palestinian society in East Jerusalem is a very fragmented one, deeply divided, very poor, suffers from a lack of resources and infrastructure, which of course also translate into the cultural arena as institutions that also need resources and support. And in that political vacuum, actually, cultural institutions sometimes function as political institutions. So whether they do it willingly and out of choice, or whether they do it just because this is the space where actually a national identity can be formed and practiced and performed. And I'm going to talk about that as I present the different themes that we found in the research. So, of course, we're not going to present the entire study that we did, but if we can summarize the different themes that we found, we can largely divide them into what we call kind of perhaps a triangle of different activities or positions or roles that combine the artistic, the social, and the political roles of arts and cultural institutions in East Jerusalem. When I mean politics, I mean, of course, politics is a very loaded and big word. When I use the word politics here, I mean in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of course, other aspects are political as well. The political dimension is, of course, extremely significant. So both in terms of areas of practice of the different institutions and how they see their position and role, but also pragmatically. Because in a sense, even if they don't want to be political, they cannot escape politics. And I'm going to touch on that later, because they're affected by the reality of whether it's checkpoints or whether it's activities that are shut down by Israeli police or security services, or whether it's because they have blocked funding channels and the infrastructure, etc. But there are also other roles beyond political that I'm going to now present. So the first role that we found is art for the sake of art. So although most of the interviewees express the notion that really one cannot completely escape the political and social issues in East Jerusalem, some still perceived arts and culture as ends in themselves. So one reason is, of course, that aesthetics provide a kind of relief from the hard reality of everyday life by allowing one to be who they are. Another reason is simply because due to the desire to create and produce arts and culture even in this context. Because Jerusalem, despite all the political context, it's also, people still live their lives there, and they might, just want to create arts and culture and consume arts and culture and enjoy it. So they don't necessarily want to be associated with a national political struggle. So that's one theme, and it was probably the smallest of all that we found in terms of explicit references to this specific role of arts and culture. The second role that we found is we called it art as welfare, or the social role of arts and culture in Jerusalem. And this indicates how arts and culture can be used to promote different social themes. It can be from physically improving the urban space. It can be through allowing opportunities for self-development, personal self-development, leadership, skills, talents, and up to cultivating even hope and inspiration in people facing a lot of hardships. So if we look at the different quotations here, so we have one of the interviewees, he said, "I don't give a shit about politics, I'm a doer. I just try to work in better living conditions for the community." Another person was saying, and she was saying it actually a bit critically, she was saying East Jerusalemites, they do not understand the exact meaning of art or what's the point of it, and prefer activities that have more concrete benefits or stress national themes and folklore, such as dabke dancing. So she's saying people are not necessarily looking for the political or for the artistic role, they want to have some practical also use. And when we look at the political role of arts and culture, which was the biggest theme, of course, it's a very significant theme, and it's also articulated in different ways. So some interviewees made explicit references to arts and culture as kind of a counteract to Israel's policy, to Israel's systematic efforts of abolishing the political leadership and political institutions in East Jerusalem. And it also, of course, means that arts and culture institutions, they have to be very careful at how they position themselves, because they cannot advertise themselves or behave as explicit political institutions, because if they do so, then of course they face the risk of being shut down by all the different authorities that I mentioned before. So even if they assume a political role, they have to do it in a certain way. It can be, for example, in a bookshop. It can be organizing book affairs about issues that the Palestinian people are dealing with. For example, having invited speakers from overseas to discuss different political institutions. But they have to be careful about it, and they can't do it too openly. And actually, the owner of the bookshop that we interviewed, he said, "I have a problem if art is not for social or political ends, transformation or help. If it doesn't serve a purpose for me, it's a waste of time." So he was actually criticizing other Palestinians in the arts and culture scene who try to shy away from political issues or do not see it as their role. He was saying, in this political climate, there is no use for art that doesn't deal with these topics. And he was very blunt and had a very strong position about it. On the other hand, we have another curator of an art festival who was saying, arts and culture have taken on a particular role, and that role is somehow filling the political weight, filling in this void in the political arena. And so cultural and artistic stakeholders see themselves as leaders of the community. So this is perhaps a softer version of the political aspect. Then we have another person who is managing the museum, I think, or a gallery, who was saying, we sometimes get visits from people from the Israeli security services who come and investigate how do we address the issue of nationalism here. So they always have to be mindful of that and consider this issue. Another political function of arts and culture is actually creating meeting points in Jerusalem. So it can be between East and West Jerusalem specifically, but also between Israeli and Palestinian publics more broadly. Again, this is against the background of a highly segregated city, a reality where the two nations don't really interact, don't really speak to each other or know each other, and often perceive each other with a lot of hostility. But the intentions behind these kind of meetings and the extent to which the interaction takes place and the nature of the interaction vary considerably among the different stakeholders. So some people kind of collaborate under the radar, so they might actually accept Israeli funding, but they will not put the municipality logo on their activities. This is something that the municipality in the beginning had a hard time with, but now kind of accepted as a way to support institutions in East Jerusalem, and they sort of understand the complexity and the fact that they kind of have to do that. So we have that solution, for example, or that kind of compromise. Some welcome Israeli visitors, for example, and use it as a way to present their narrative. So in this quotation, you can see the museum welcomes everybody. Israeli visitors are welcome. However, we do not work with Israelis because we have a red line. So we're okay with having them at our place and explaining and showing our narrative, but we don't work with them, we don't collaborate with them. Whereas other people actually work and collaborate with Israelis, whether they do it explicitly or not. So one interview was saying there are obviously different kinds of collaborations under the radar without making a fuss about it with different cultural initiatives and art schools in West Jerusalem. These activities are volatile and delicate since it's enough that a 17-year-old will write a Facebook post about it involving BDS and it will ruin everything. So that will be basically the end of that. And others choose not to collaborate at all, either because they're not interested, or they have either because they have a political motive, not to so-called normalize the occupation or to work with the occupier, or also simply because it's just not a priority for them. So they have limited resources, they have limited capacities, and they prefer to focus on their local audiences and their local needs. There are some exceptions to that. So there is one venue, it's called Filbet. I guess the local ones know it. And it started as a festival. It's called Mekudeshet, which is Israeli festival that actually has a branch that's dedicated to East Jerusalem. And they're explicitly trying to bring people together and have them meet and share their cultures. So you can see this is from an interview with one of the curators, the Palestinian curator who is in charge of that. So she said, we brought artists, musicians from different backgrounds, Hebrew, Arabic, Druze, trying to present on the stage all kinds of different identities that represent what the city is, the country that we're living in, and kind of modeling in a way and saying, okay, this is possible. It's possible to be Hebrew, English, Arabic, English, all of them to be at the same time on the same stage. And they also have these tours that are called, I think, border dissolving, where they actually, the purpose is actually to try and meet with different stakeholders from different parts of the city and in strategic geopolitical sites often, so along the Green Line, for example, to also make that present in the city as well. But not that many initiatives like that. I would say this is rather the exception, but these initiatives also exist. But political issues, they're not just confined to Israel and Palestine, or West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, because East Jerusalem is actually trapped between the West Bank and Israel, and it belongs neither there nor there. It's kind of its own territory. So arts and culture actually also serve as a tool for making connections between Palestinians themselves. So between Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, for example, and other Palestinian communities, whether in the West Bank or whether in Israel. So to kind of use that platform to build and strengthen a national identity. So for many of the interviewees, creating a shared Palestinian cultural space is actually the most pressing objective at the moment, and they direct the look and the perspective inwards and not outwards, not towards Israel, but toward their own community. And they do that in various ways. And we have one of the interviews was saying, which I think is a great slogan for a T-shirt, there is no green line when it comes to art and culture. So we try to actually build bridges between the different Palestinian communities. And I think the last aspect, which is not explicit political aspect, is actually the global aspect of arts and culture. So some arts and culture institutions, they wish to connect to more universal, more cosmopolitan themes, which tackle, of course, pressing issues in the East Jerusalem reality, but extend beyond it. So initiatives like a local sustainability center, which we could maybe find a similar one in Berlin or in London or in Malmo. So kind of focusing on issues such as local economic development and leadership and gender and sustainability. And they try to do that in different ways. So for example, through building, for example, collaborations with abroad by doing joint residencies and programs, and Palestinian artists going to different places abroad and visiting them, and also having international artists coming to stay in East Jerusalem and building those joint workshops and festivals and programs. And they also offer professional training and development and just exchange of knowledge and ideas. But also just working on more global issues. So of course, and some of them actually go as far as defining themselves as apolitical. And of course, some could contest this definition, because by the fact that they're working in East Jerusalem and facing all of these issues, they cannot really be apolitical, but that's their own definition and their own emphasis. So I'm going to conclude. I'm not sure we have I'm not sure exactly how I want to finish it, because I want to open it up to more questions. But I think there's been a lot of writing about Jerusalem as a divided city or a colonial city, or whichever terminology you choose to use. And a lot of it has really focused on urban planning and the built environment. And we believe that actually looking at arts and culture is another lens through which we can understand all of these difficulties and all of these nuances and all of these complex dynamics that happen, because it's always a gray reality. It's never black and white, but it's also another means to understand it. And of course, the separation that we do between the artistic and the social and the political, it's analytical. It's not we cannot completely separate these different entities, and sometimes they work together and they complement each other. So a museum can be focused on Palestinian heritage and have a very explicit goal, but also welcome Israeli visitors and also have global outreach programs. So all of these things can coexist. But I think another interesting thing that we notice is that, and this goes back to Marav's earlier presentation about what is the urban and what is the national, is something urban just because it happens in the city? And we found that actually a lot of the emphasis or a lot of the objectives of these institutions, they're really focused on the national and not on the urban. So they take place in the city, and sometimes they have explicit urban dimensions, but not always. So I think I will finish here with this perhaps insight that yes, of course, Jerusalem is it is a unique geopolitical context, and the political aspects are present in every single element of life in East Jerusalem, including arts and culture. But perhaps there are some commonalities and similarities that we can draw also from Jerusalem to other less divided cities and perhaps other ordinary cities as well. So that's it. Thank you.
So, um, let us have now our last panelist for this panel, who's Professor Ishai Blank. He's the Dean of the Law Faculty at Tel Aviv University, a scholar of local government law, administrative law, global cities, urban legal policy, and law and secularism and legal theory. He obtained his degrees long time ago, and since then has done such a long road that I see no reason to go back to that. But undoubtedly, yeah, I think, well, you can Google it. But anyways, very inspiring scholar and friend, and I really look forward to hear what you have for us today.
Thank you. So Ronit is a very young scholar, as is obvious. Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's just going to be me with no presentation, with no PowerPoint. And what I want to talk today about are legal concepts. So this is going to be a really legal paper. It will be tied to various developments, obviously in the real world, but I am mostly interested in thinking through three legal concepts that can also be seen as non-legal concepts. For me, they're legal. One is local autonomy, the second is solidarity, and the third is belonging. And again, even though all of them, of course, have contents that can be non-legal, I'm thinking about them as legal concepts. And the reason I'm thinking about them is, first of all, that I now, for the past few years, I've been thinking more and more about the concept of local autonomy. In Israel especially, it has been developed by courts in the past decade or so. And so I was interested in figuring out exactly what might it mean, not just what the court kind of haphazardly is doing in various court cases, but what could it mean as a coherent legal and also political concept. And also the concept of local autonomy, we can see a rise in this concept globally. So it's not just in Israel. It's very interesting that we can see various international NGOs use it, or international organizations. We see it cropping up in various other legal contexts. And so, like many developments that on one hand are extremely local or national, and on the other hand are global, it's kind of mysterious the way it works. It's unclear whether these concepts really travel, but it's clear that they're developing in various contexts. So this is my interest in local autonomy, and I was, again, interested in seeing how it is both operated by the courts, how it resolves various tensions, and for me the most basic tensions that, that kind of is on the surface is that with the notion of solidarity. So at the heart, we could say, of the law governing cities, or also various policies, and I think that, you know, when Stefan was talking, I was also thinking about that, about various, you know, management of COVID, of education, of climate control, of various, and I would say most of the stuff that cities are dealing with. There is a tension between the notion of local autonomy and of national solidarity. What does it mean? It means, on one hand, the concept that cities, first and foremost, take care of their own residents. We could call them citizens, to follow up on Nir and Avner's notion of kind of local residency, which is citizenship. I'll say something about that later on. So they owe a duty to their residents. Okay, they first of all have to take care of their citizens. So this is kind of the notion of local autonomy. I'll elaborate more, but this is kind of the core. But on the other hand, we're not in the realm or in the times of medieval cities where it's only local autonomy, or I would say this is actually local sovereignty. So there is a distinction there that I will talk more about. We're part, or it's clear that what I'm talking about is a context in which cities are part of a greater nation, a national project, national polity, etc. And this is what I kind of term the national solidarity. And there's a tension. There's an inherent tension between them. There is a constant tension, I would say, at various levels, at the level of the policymakers or the mayor, the council members, but also often at the level of the citizen or the local resident, him or herself, that on one hand feel tied or connected, or I'll use belonging to the local polity, but on the other hand, they are also part of a greater national polity. I would say sometimes even a regional, but sometimes even a global kind of polity. Now, again, as a legal concept or as legal concepts, what I'm interested in, I'll elaborate more soon, is on how are these two principles actually manifesting themselves, in what kind of conflicts, regulations, laws, etc. And before I go into that, I want to say that it is often also denied. So while I kind of present this as a clear tension, you could see various legal systems and various scholars that would simply deny that. How would they deny it? In two main strategies. One is to deny the autonomy, and the second is to deny the solidarity. So how do we deny autonomy? We just say, well, cities are not autonomous. They're state agents. They're just like any other agent of the state. They're not autonomous. They don't owe any particular duty to their residents, or if they do, it's really insignificant, it's minor, it's nothing, and if they do it, it's bad, and they should stop doing these autonomous things, so autonomy is denied. And the second strategy is to deny solidarity. That is, deny the fact that actually cities owe a solidarity. How would that be done? Because we're clearly in some kind of a network within a national setting. It will be delegated to the nation. Okay, so it's not that cities are under the pressure. Cities are should be autonomous. They should do whatever they want. And if they go beyond their reach, then the nation would kind of hit them on the head. So it's not that they are in internal conflict or that there's a real conflict between these two principles at the local level. At the local level, there is only autonomy, and the state is responsible for solidarity. It is also at the level, let's say, of the fantasies of economists. Let's take someone like Thibault, right, with a theory that puts economic competition at the heart of what localities do. So there we are in a fantasy of competition. Cities are only autonomous. This is what they do. They only compete. The state is the kind of very minimal state in the libertarian fantasies that we actually see more and more. So it's not just a fable or a tale from the past, from history, it's also there. So first of all, I want to say that often this tension that I'm putting on the table is denied, and it is denied again, not as a reality, but that as a legal principle or legal principles, they don't really actually are in tension. And I would say that there is also a difference, if I kind of look comparatively speaking at different legal systems, then in continental Europe, it's easier sometimes, not all of it, it is sometimes easier to deny the tension because local autonomy is denied. How it is denied? It is denied by saying that, again, cities are not real autonomous, they're not real legal entities, they're kind of semi-state, with, of course, with the notion of the préfet in France, that, you know, there is no real autonomy. However, if we look deeply or more thoroughly, first of all, in common law systems, the nature of the city as an independent corporation is far more clear, and there also comes with it kind of the notion of autonomy. But also, you know, from what I read in various case studies, but also in the literature, you know, even on Germany, France, etc., it's clear that the remnants of local autonomy are there as well, often also manifested through this very concept of local autonomy. Okay, how should such, but as I said, I think that actually this tension is there, and that it's a constitutive tension, and it's not kind of something that can be pushed or denied. And then I'm interested in seeing how is this tension managed. And this dialectical relationship again between the autonomy and the solidarity. I'm again kind of trying to elaborate on both these legal principles, and as I said, what I'm also interested in is in the third, which is the belonging, which is in a sense a moderating or a third concept that moderates between the solidarity and autonomy, and I'll say more about that. This is just kind of the structure of how I'm going to talk about it. Now, the last thing that I want to say as kind of the preamble is the context in which the general, or I would say almost the eternal tension between local autonomy and solidarity manifests itself is in the current times, and this is kind of the conflict between the urban and the rural. So it's not just that abstractly speaking we are thinking about, how do we deal with autonomy, a city wanting to express its own internal values and the nation not being very happy about that. So it's not just kind of the vertical, which is the city versus the nation, but it is often manifesting itself, this tension between localities and themselves. And so this is kind of the horizontal element of solidarity, if you will, but also of autonomy. So it is the autonomy of the city vis-a-vis the small town, the rural, etc. And what we have now is kind of a casting or a recasting of the tension between solidarity and autonomy in the tension between liberal cities and illiberal towns, between democratic urban areas and authoritarian or pro-authoritarian rural areas, rural surrounding, between urban affluence and I would say middle class or sometimes even poverty ex-urban, and between global elites and local people. And in no sense am I adopting this kind of framing, but what we see is that this kind of tension manifests itself also in the concrete or in the, I would say, contemporary urban versus rural voting patterns and everything that, I could have had slides here that would just demonstrate that. Okay, so what I want to do, and again, this is kind of what I will do, is to argue, however, that a way to understand the tension or to see the tension a little differently is to read solidarity as stemming from autonomy and not as opposing it. So, okay, so this kind was the, how do you say it when you destroy your own your own pun. So this is kind of my conclusion where I want to end is by trying to say that instead of seeing them as just countering each other or contrasting each other, is to read solidarity in a sense as something that stems from autonomy and not as something which is alien against it. Okay, so now I want to move to what is local autonomy, and Ronit, just give me, when I'm talking too much, just tell me and I'll stop. Okay, so I'm old, so I forget the time.
You said you accomplished so much. That was important.
So what is local autonomy? As I said, it is an intermediary concept between sovereignty on one hand and state agency on the other. Okay, so when I'm trying to argue that actually what we have as an important operative concept at the local level, which is local autonomy, I'm not claiming sovereignty. Okay, so sovereignty is definitely there, but on the other hand, there is the state agent. Okay, so this would be again the position that denies autonomy, which localities are just the long arm of the state. They're doing nothing of their own. They're just obeying orders. There's the slaves, etc. I'm arguing for the local autonomy, which is the intermediary concept, which on one hand, therefore, means that there is a certain sphere of decision, of immunity. I'll develop immediately various senses of this. But on the other hand, they're not fully independent. Of course, they're still bound by duties of solidarity that are the meaning of them being part of a larger polity. As I said, they're separately incorporated. There is a veil of incorporation, often that separates them from the states. They owe often legal duties of care to their residents. If so some courts or legal principles would actually say that as council members, you actually owe a duty to your citizenry before, or at least in parallel to the nation, etc., etc. And I want to say that, however, when we think again, kind of legally about what it means to be autonomous, then I have like 5 separate things that I want to now very quickly go over. So the first is broad authorization and broad discretion. Again, we can think about how do we authorize or how do we let cities do various things. And if we think that cities are not autonomous, then of course we will very narrowly authorize them, and we will keep their discretion to be very narrow and very minimal. And here, what again, if you follow a principle of local autonomy, or the more you use it, the broader the authorization would be, and the broader the discretion would be. And again, here you can actually see this in various court cases or in various legal systems, that if they want to pursue real local autonomy, they would of course do that. The second is narrow central government intervention. Okay, so it's not the same as the broad authorization from the get-go. So there would be a limitation on how much government can intervene. So I'll just give a couple of examples from Israel. In Israel, localities are, and I'm mostly giving it to our foreign guests, are authorized to deal with matters of religion. So let's say business licensing, and business licensing immediately means what do you do on Saturday, on Shabbat, and are you allowed to sell pork or other elements that can be offensive to various religions. And according to, again, kind of the authorizing laws, localities are the first to actually deal with that. They decide where various stores can open, whether they can operate on Saturday or not. However, when they do that, so when a mayor or when a council signs a bylaw that prohibits or allows for the sale of pork or for the opening of stores on Saturday, the Minister of Interior actually needs to sign this bylaw. Okay, so there is a review by the Minister of Interior. Now the question is, how do you interpret the review power of the minister? So can the minister actually decide on his own terms whether this bylaw, again about Saturday or pork, is balancing correctly between religion, conscience, freedom of movement, freedom of occupation, etc., or whether the minister is actually limited by a certain set of reasons of why should this bylaw be either, again, authorized or prohibited. And what we see, again, in Israel, for example, the more you move to local autonomy, the more you curb the authority of the Minister of Interior to intervene, okay? So you actually shift the power from the center to the locality. It doesn't mean that the minister would have no authority at all. It just means that you narrow or you shrink down the central intervention, the central government intervention. The third element of local autonomy, and this is kind of the dark side of local autonomy, is various acts of self-regarding, of hoarding, of local protectionism, etc. We saw it during COVID. For example, when various localities, not in Israel, but in other contexts, started to hoard vaccination or hoard masks, that is to accumulate more than they actually needed because they were local protectionists. But it happens all the time. Okay, so NIMBY is just a classical example of this kind of type of behavior, and I'm mentioning it because, again, for many, local autonomy means these wicked, I would say, or maybe use your term, wicked behaviors. And again, obviously, if localities have autonomy, then they might use it in these despicable or maybe understandable ways. The fourth kind of, again, meaning of local autonomy is acting against governmental policies. Okay, so here we're not just in some kind of maybe disagreement between the Minister of Interior that doesn't like the exact policies of the locality, etc., but in direct conflict. Examples. So, for example. In the context of two peace plans that were in Israel. The first in 1995 during the Rabin government with the negotiation between Israel and Syria. There was a time when actually it seemed to be reasonable or a reasonable future that Israel will sign a peace accord with Syria and will withdraw from the Golan Heights. There was a huge campaign throughout Israel that was called Ha'am im Golan, the people is with the Golan. And it was a campaign against the withdrawal from the Golan Heights if such an accord would ever be signed. Turned out that the funding for this campaign came from localities in the Golan Heights, and one resident of such a locality petitioned to the court saying that this was an ultra-virus, that is, that the locality behaved against its authority. Why is it against its authority? Various legal arguments, but a main argument was it's going against the policy of the government, which states that it wants to withdraw from the Golan, or at least possibly so, and therefore, by definition, it needs to be outside of its authority. Interestingly, the court actually grants the authority to the localities to fund the campaign, and not only that this is decided in, again, 95, it is also expanded during the Sharon government plan to withdraw from the Gaza area. So in 10 years after the Rabin government, actually the government of Sharon plans to, as we know, to withdraw from the Gaza region, which eventually it did. And many localities, again, based on what happens 10 years ago, decide to fund a campaign against the withdrawal from Gaza. And again, a direct contradiction to the locality, to the policy of the government. And again, the court actually enables that, even expanding further the ability of localities to oppose government policies. And again, the more local autonomy you have, you might also interpret it in ways that contradict governmental policies. And the last one that I want to mention is even stricter limitations on central government, and this time even on legislative actions. That is not only on decisions by the government, by non-elected officials, by the executive, but also by the parliament. That is some kind of a constitutional protection to the principle of local autonomy. I will not get into the details here, but this really would, at least in various jurisdictions, would radicalize the power of localities in the sense that it would place them, again, or the principle of local autonomy, even as a shield against legislative proposals that would try to take away power from them. I will only say that here it would, for lawyers at least, it will be interesting to see whether this right for local autonomy is an individual right or is it a structural feature of the system. Okay, if it's an individual right, that is, we each and every one of us has the right to local autonomy and therefore a government that would serve these interests of local autonomy, or whether it is not about an individual right but rather as a structural feature. Which moves me to the question of what is solidarity, and I think that I have 3 more minutes, to the principle of solidarity, and here the question is what? And as I already said, I understand solidarity is operating in 2 ways, the vertical and the horizontal. That is, on one hand, it would be, again, the duty or the belonging, I will say really very few words about that, between the locality and the nation, or between the local sphere and the national sphere. And here, actually, what you would have is kind of an idea that solidarity, again, both at the personal level of the individuals, but especially of the managers, etc., that they also constantly have to think about these 2 spheres, the local sphere and the national sphere, and constantly balance them and not just wait for someone from above to actually tell them you can't do that. And at the horizontal level, which is for me even more significant, it is the duty of the locality to also care for its surrounding. That is, and especially again in the highly contentious settings of very rich urban areas and kind of with poorer circles around them, that would mean redistribution of wealth. It might mean various duties of integration and various other meanings such as that. So again, here solidarity would operate, as I said, as a self-constraining principle and not as something that stems from without. And here I want to say really just one thing about that, of how or why do I think that actually solidarity stems from autonomy? And here it goes to the question of why autonomy at all. Okay, so I was very quick to actually just somehow hypothesize that we have local autonomy. The question is why? And I don't have enough time to get into that, but it can, again, it can either come from, as I said, an individual right for local autonomy that would be a certain correlate of the principle of democracy, that is of self-rule. And here the understanding, or at least my attempt to develop, and I do it in the article where I talk about autonomy or local autonomy, is that we, at least in our age of representative democracies, that real protection of democracy requires local democracy, or in the stricter sense of local self-rule. Okay, so representative democracy only provides with a very, very partial protection of the real or the profound right and meaning of what is it mean to have a right for democracy or of self-rule, and that therefore an element of local self-rule is a necessary part of the right to democracy. And again, there are other ways also to justify local autonomy. It can be with kind of more policy-oriented. This would be the structure rather than individual right. And here it would be, separation of power. It would be laboratories of experimentation. It would be competition and economic efficiency. It can be pluralism or multiculturalism. So again, kind of as a structure, the principle of local autonomy can either come from an individual right to democracy or from more policy structural considerations. So just one word about what about belonging. So even though, again, I would say probably rightly think of belonging as psychological and sociological concepts, for me, the interesting element is the legal corollary of those. And the illegal corollary of those, that is of belonging, is through the concepts of residency or citizenship. That is, these are the legal bounds or the expressions of what we feel or don't feel. They sometimes, again, obviously we can feel that we don't belong to a place and yet be its residents or citizens, etc., and vice versa. But there are correlations between them, and obviously it would be interesting to have, of course, and there are various empirical studies about what is the relationship between the sense of belonging and how much your citizenship or residency are active or etc. But here again, the content and exercise of either residency or citizenship, the way we want to call it, would also again express the connection and the tension between autonomy, between local autonomy and national solidarity. That is, since we are actually with multiple residencies, that is, we are, or citizenship, we're residents of the location, but also of the city, that is, also of the state, then often what we will see is that the various duties and exercises of these belongings, the legal belongings, that is, of resident and citizenship, will also express and shape the tension or the dialectics between solidarity and citizenship and local autonomy. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much again for these fascinating talks. I have multiple questions, but I'll start with the crowd. So anyone with a question or a comment, please raise your hand.
Thank you. These were three fascinating talks, and I guess I'll start with one question. To Stefan, this seems to me like a very radical policy in the sense that it was there was a lot of intervention, to use the terms that we used earlier. and I wondered how it was marketed to the people of Vienna and how it gained legitimacy and whether it gained legitimacy immediately. So, you know, investing so much money in testing, and obviously the idea that the city municipality buys shares of businesses, which is amazing and echoes what Barack Obama did in 2008 in the federal level, but it is like a socialist policy, which for me is fine, but I wondered what the people of Vienna thought about it.
In general, I would say, oh, sorry. In general, so now, my very general answer would be, I guess what we observed in the crisis was the state is back. So, and this also is a little difference to the refugee crisis when we started to investigate actually crisis management of the city. The city was kind of, they did a lot, but covertly in the background, you know, and there were non-profit organizations filling the stage, but the city did not so much. And there was a strong, in 2020, I would say there was this, they were backed by the people. They wanted the state to act, the city to act, the national government to act. So there was not so much criticism. There wasn't even the debate, interestingly, about this. And the only funny thing is, back then, the Green Party was part of the government. There was a government coalition. And also interesting, that was something I would tell you perhaps later, because we had elections in 2020. The Vienna government, there were governmental elections. And then they entered a coalition within NEOS, which is a very liberal party. And the city officials, they were laughing because they said, with them, wouldn't have been possible. Buy shares in private companies, never ever. But before, it was no, it just worked. Now, there are media reports kind of having a look at the companies, how they did perform after that. And two went bankrupt, you know, and there's a little discussion, but not the discussion they actually feared would happen. So my easy explanation is people wanted to see a strong public hand, as we say in German, right? Öffentliche Hand. You know?
So people knew at the time that these companies are being bought by the city?
Yes,
It was known.
all public. Yes, yes.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I have two questions. Thank you. The first one is to Stefan. I was curious to hear whether you can see different patterns in managing governance gaps of COVID versus the immigrant crisis or other type of research that you did about governance gap, and what are the type of differences. And the other question is to Nufar and Merav. You define between culture in the city and planning in the city as kind of different lens to analyze what's going on. And I know that both of you know that they are very much interconnected, and that there's cultural planning and different type of strategies, and that culture became huge things in managing cities. And I was wondering whether you've seen this kind of interaction also in the strategies that you've seen by these type of institutions. I can say about West Jerusalem that culture became very much a urban thing, and that artists are becoming urbanist in their strategies, sometimes even giving away the arts and culture aspect in the practice, and that today, the municipality itself is using these strategies of transforming arts and culture in East Jerusalem to be a more urban thing by funding placemaking initiatives. And I think your data is a bit earlier than this stage, but I was wondering whether you could see that in your data as well. And also just to hear a bit about censorship. Whether it came up in the interviews and the way that the institution are operating. all lectures were fascinating. Thanks.
I think that in East Jerusalem we're seeing some evidence of that. So, for example, there has been a program to do placemaking projects in East Jerusalem that was part of the Jerusalem Economic Development Corporation. But I don't think we've seen many initiatives, and even the body within the municipality that is in charge actually of arts and culture is not in the arts and culture development for East Jerusalem. It's in a different division, like the social services division, which is something that was actually upsetting for a lot of the interviewees, because they're saying, you know, in West Jerusalem they're receiving the funding and the support mechanisms, and they have appropriate bodies within the municipality, and we don't have that. But I think it also, you know, so perhaps the municipality is partly to blame for that, but I think for obvious reasons there is also a reason why it works differently in two parts of the city. So even if we look at placemaking, for example, so the whole idea of using public space is of course trickier and more problematic in East Jerusalem, not just because you have less of it, but also I would say it's not, I don't know if it's just a matter of time that it's, you know, it's not there yet. It doesn't have this tradition, and maybe it will change over time, or it's not going to change because of the whole political complexity, and it's not going to be used in the same way that it's used in West Jerusalem.
I'm not sure if I got your question right. So the question was if we see patterns in how governance gaps are addressed here. Other than COVID. Okay, so actually our idea would be that this is not so much particular about COVID. So actually the idea would be that this is, with some limitations, generalizable. This much brief answer. Was this the question? Is this about COVID only, or is this? We did see similar patterns, so we were actually well prepared to investigate the COVID case, and we saw several patterns confirmed. Perhaps one difference, what I just said, is that the how do you say this? The self-awareness and the Selbstbewusstsein, how self-confident the government acted was differently, because back then in 2015, a little more backdoor stuff, you know, and now more, right? Yeah, that would but generally I would say these are patterns of how challenges of the kind that are wicked are addressed, and not so much about COVID.
Please.
Thank you very much. 3 fascinating talks. I have a question for Stefan and one for Yishai. First, a fact check, just to see that I forgive my ignorance about Austrian politics, just to make sure that I'm correct, that the city of Vienna functions both as a municipal council and as a state parliament. That's correct, right? And the mayor he's a mayor and also a governor. Okay, so the question goes as follows. So what happens under which capacity? I mean, there's the authority of the city and the authority of the state. I mean, if I want to think about your project comparatively, I am wondering whether the analysis of the external focus and internal focus changes if we focus only on the city capacities and only on the state capacities, if we analytically separate the two. And the question for Yishai, I still want to think about, you know, the whole analysis, and I want to throw in a fourth concept following a previous discussion, and that's the issue of regionalism. I mean, I'm thinking about the horizontal relationships that you mentioned as a limitation to autonomy, but the notion of regionalism, to some extent, is supposed to foster exactly these types of horizontal relationship based on trust, cooperation, collaboration, etc. So how and if we bring regionalism if we put regionalism on the table as a form of, you know, bottom-up regionalism, or you know where I'm going with this, does it override the limitations or the tensions between that you portrayed between solidarity and autonomy?
Sure. Thanks. So if I had more time, I would elaborate on actually the fact that regionalism is in a way an outcome of my talk. So when I wrote about regionalism, I didn't conceptualize it this way, but today I would do the same in the sense that definitely one of the main impetuses for developing a thick notion of regionalism is because it answers in a way the duty of solidarity, especially of the horizontal one, not so much the vertical, even though you could also make a case for this one, but mostly the horizontal one. I will just add, I will use this as something to add from the concept, or at least for me, of autonomy also stems an insistence of democratic structures internally. Okay, so this is kind of another element that is in the picture. I won't say a lot about that, but again, if you think of why to have an autonomy from what I said, you also would draw a set of legal duties to actually enforce, reinforce democratic structures within, and also at the regional level, but also at the local level.
To overcome the local challenge.
Yes.
Associating democracy with localism.
Right.
The long answer to your question would be, of course, what you're pointing at is the multi-level governance complexity of Austria, the federalism and stuff. The brief answer would be, I mean, the main difference is the city senate of Vienna is allowed to pass laws. That's the main difference, right? So they can implement laws, but because they are a province at the same time. Yeah, but that's an important capacity. But it wasn't that much. It wasn't that important in the whole thing. I would say actually Vienna acted mainly as a municipality and a city, because all the departments of the organization I was talking about actually were municipal organizations, public utilities. Provinces don't have that in that range. But all these organizations offering public services of daily need, typical of kommunale Daseinsvorsorge would be the German term, right? This typical way of how cities provide services, public services. So I guess what we saw here was a city acting. It was not a state province acting, because there were 8 other state provinces and they didn't do anything similar.
Yes, please.
Hi, I have 2 questions. First of all, about Vienna. I was wondering, now after that, during the pandemic, the city implemented all these great management ideas. Did something change, or is it now back to normal? I mean, did implement the thing for this SOS, did it change how you act today? And Nofar, I was wondering, first of all, I really liked the whole talk, and I was thinking about a paper I read like a few years ago, sorry, don't remember whom, talking about how people in different, in an Arab city and an Arab settlement feel differently how they can act in the public space, how the level of how they can stand out or be anonymous. I was wondering if you think this affects how the system works, or is it more because of the whole political government system from above? I mean, I know it's both, but like, I was wondering, like, and if you have more money, I would just simply love to see how, like, this research would go to Lod, or would go to another city, seeing how if things change there. Or is this unique to the Arab community? Is it unique to Arab community that is in a diversity, or is it unique to the East, Jerusalem?
I think it's a really good question and an interesting one. I'm not sure I have the answer for you, because we mostly interviewed, and did our research on the stakeholders themselves, so not the users necessarily of these spaces and activities and institutions. So my intuitive my intuition is that, yeah, there are differences, you know, between different cities, different regions, that are not only because of the political tension and the complexity of Jerusalem. So the whole sense of public space would also perhaps change, depending if it's a small town or a big city, or if people know each other or not, or you have the anonymity factor, etc. But I don't think I have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
Nofar, I want to continue this line with some more thoughts. So, first of all, it seems that art activity is something that can be done by the residents with limited state or city intervention. Unlike, suppose, schools, kindergarten, parks, etc., which are land consuming and therefore are in need for more public involvement in their distribution. And from my research, I know that the city of Jerusalem really is incapable of providing this type of goods. So in a sense, you were able to capture a type of public good which the East Jerusalemites are able to create by themselves. So it's a really interesting example to think how they operate despite the fact that there is no operative local governance or state governance, whatever. But the question here is East Jerusalem operating in the political sense, in the Palestinian political sense, as a sort of a corpus spartum, some island of its own that is not really the focal of artistic activities for Palestine. So what I would encourage you to think of next, maybe collaborative projects, to compare between Ramallah and East Jerusalem. As Ramallah being, you're laughing because you were thinking about it.
Merav and I are nodding because we kind of, we thought of... Yeah. There's, yeah. No, we're smiling because we're thinking about it.
Okay.
And there has been some work done on Haifa as actually the cultural capital of Israel by an anthropologist, Nadim Kalkabi, who is saying that actually the majority of cultural activity now in the Arab Palestinian society is in Haifa. So Jerusalem is not the epicenter, and of course the other center, like you mentioned, is Ramallah. So your understanding is correct.
So also, I would wonder about your classification of yourselves as foreigners, and that is something that I wouldn't think I do, because you are not a foreigner, but rather an active participant as an Israeli, isn't it?
I think I used the word outsider, which I think is accurate. I mean, there are big, anyway, I speak Arabic, but not to the extent that I can do in-depth interviews. There are a lot of places and spaces that I cannot go to, or I wouldn't feel comfortable going to, even if I can physically go there. So I don't think I'm local to that scene.
The question is, how did the interviewees saw you?
It's actually... Yeah. I actually forgot to mention it, so I'm glad you brought it up. So there are two significant cultural institutions in East Jerusalem who did not want to take part in the research. Not because of us specifically, they don't collaborate with Israeli institutions, and we're part of the Hebrew University. So this is an example of how we're actually perceived as outsiders to the locals themselves. Occupiers, for sure, yeah, goes without saying, I think. So of course we did our best to complement the information from other sources and other informants. But we do not claim to represent them.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. We'll have Stefan's answer now.
Very briefly, what did last? First of all, of course, the investments did last. But very important point I forgot to mention, it was very clear that after 5 years, the city of Vienna would de-invest. So then this thing would be over. This was clear right from the beginning. But to your question, I think there is an important difference about what is a crisis and what might be a societal challenge. Because a crisis actually, and we were very keen about that, and in terms of the crisis definition we are using in our work, which is by Ricoeur, which is a moment in time. So that interrupts the flow of events, and this means a crisis must be over somewhere at a certain point in time. And the pandemic is over. And I think this is very important because what I described here, the pace of reaction, the intensity, this boom, 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 you can't sustain this over time. It's impossible. So the city of Vienna ran in that mode about 1.5 years or so, but then it's exhausted. Then you have to go back to some kind of new normal, perhaps. So in terms of what did last, I think it's important to say this crisis is over, and there is some new normal, which is different from the normal before, which is important to the definition of crisis, because you learn, you develop, you do things differently. But this exhaustive state of crisis mode is over. This is something we address in one of the publications, and I guess it's quite important.
I relate in the sense that we are in the midst of a crisis in our defending our democracy. Yeah.
Hopefully, no new normal.
I'm sure there will be new normal. Yes, please, Ty.
Yeah, I wanted to ask something about regions, but now I have another question, because I think this idea that the crisis is over is a very it's not true, first of all. And the moment that Berlin gave up all the regulations was the moment that the next crisis started, namely the refugee crisis, that Putin started the war. So all of a sudden we had thousands and thousands of people unvaccinated in the station. The only thing that the state could do was abolish some of the regulations, because none of the people that arrived had a document that said they were vaccinated twice and therefore could enter place A, B, or C. So I think the idea that this is just, there's a political decision of when, and I know we're taping this, and I notice that I find it uncomfortable that it's being taped, because when you say there was no debate, it's also been a time that anyone who was critical of anything had a really difficult time debating any of those things, because the idea that if you were critical, you must be an anti-vax was really, really strong in the German debate, in the German language debate especially. So without wanting to sound like I'm one of those that, I'm not at all, but I do think we have to realize that the broad acceptance of these regulations and the broad acceptance of all these interventions and the broad acceptance of the fact that we closed playgrounds. Remember? We closed playgrounds. We put red and white tape on playgrounds and everybody swallowed it. And I think the fact that we did that had a lot to do with fear, with a lot to do with the construction of fear. The endless recycling of certain images of Italy at the beginning of the crisis had an effect. And if you interview people about their fear, they say, well, in the beginning I was really fearful because they were telling us, this is what people say, they were telling us, we are all going to die, especially if we're smokers. So I think that to sort of present this now as I don't know, maybe that's the sociologist versus the management school, we shouldn't do that, but I wonder if that is, if we should reflect more on this aspect of this sort of idea that it was a crisis and it's no longer a crisis and now it's a new normal, and adopt a slightly more critical attitude maybe to that.
Ishai, I think maybe you can follow up on this comment.
I don't know, but I did have a question. Not sure it's exactly a follow-up, but in a sense it is, because it seemed as if everything went a little too smoothly in your presentation. That is, I was wondering where conflict came, maybe not in the COVID, but you didn't insist on having an exception for COVID, but rather that this is an example of what always happens. And at least in my examples, I insisted on the conflict. So we'd say, okay, don't focus too much on the conflict, but where would conflicts actually arise? How would they be managed?
perhaps three. I try to be brief. Three things. Of course, it depends on the perspective. And in the management science, we have a discussion if this VUCA thing is the new normal, how to respond that in organizational management terms, and how this is different from crisis, and if there can be something like a permanent crisis, or if this actually runs counter the very definition of what the crisis is. So it's an interesting conceptual question. Second, to your question, where was the conflict in my presentation? Perhaps two brief answers. First, the biggest conflict, and this might be interesting for you, was between the Vienna government and the national government. Because the national government was run by the Conservative Party, and Vienna is kind of the power center of social democracy in Austria. And whatever Vienna did, the national government would do the exact opposite. So there was ongoing struggle, ongoing conflict, really harsh, actually. So the national government said, Vienna, these guys are crazy, actually, what they do. Because in Vienna, for example, they didn't close the playgrounds. And they say to the national government, are you crazy? You can't lock people in. We have to do something about this. And the interesting effect here was that it actually spurred the capacity to act of the city, because people stood together closer. Haltung, there is even a term in Vienna for that, the Wiener Weg, Viennese way. We do different from the national government, you know? So it even strengthened actually the capacity to act. And internally there was conflict, but they managed to do this within kind of locked doors within the city administration. We were told there was a lot of conflict, actually.
And there was no attempt to either retaliate by the central government or to take away powers, so you would amend the legislation that authorizes, etc.?
Well, you know, this is the multi-governance issue. Mm-hmm. So in some ways they couldn't do that. In some ways they did, and then the national government did, and then changed its course. So there was an ongoing conflict. You can watch that on TV every day. So the mayor of Vienna saying something, next day, minister...
Sure.
Yeah, but that is an ongoing thing. Vienna and the national level, kind of. Okay.
Yes, Katja, please.
Thank you. So this goes to Shai about autonomy and sovereignty. So there is this city called Afula. I don't know if you've ever been there. Okay, those of you who are not from here, it's a town in the north of, not the very north of Israel, but near the north of Israel. And it's not small, it's mid-size, and it's like, in a way, it's like a metropolitan city because it serves quite a big region. And in the region, there are a lot of Arabs and Bedouins who are Arabic tribes. And yet the city of Afula is run by a mayor who is openly racist. And he interpreted some of the laws in a way which enabled him to declare that the city will discriminate in its budgets against Muslims, and that it will even consider limiting the access of Arabs or non-Jews to parks and playgrounds and so on. So that's autonomy, and it's very opposed to solidarity with the region. So I wondered whether your idea that solidarity does not conflict with autonomy, well, isn't it true only for liberal cities?
Great. So first of all, my whole project is in a way to prevent local autonomy from going crazy. So the way that we see it operating in a lot of the legal literature is actually in a way that would put under its auspices also racist. And then you would say, okay, so this is local autonomy, and then you would place some external limitations on it. And my project is an attempt to place internal limitations from the concept itself, to say if you are committed really to the principle of local autonomy, it cannot include this move of non-recognition of the other locality. Okay, so if you want to be recognized as being entitled to an autonomy, it is inherent that you would also recognize the other's autonomy, that is, its ability to exist, etc., etc. So this is where exactly my project comes from. Now, obviously, not everyone will agree to that, etc. And I'm not saying that there aren't other external limitations. It is simply an attempt to say that local autonomy is not simply a mandate to do whatever you want, no matter what the content, racist or anti-democratic as it is.
Can you please explain what's the difference between banning Arabs renting houses or something like that and pork bylaws?
In the sense...
Sorry for the... I'm just asking in terms of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So you are arguing in favor of autonomy in terms of such bylaws as Saturdays activities and pork sales and so forth. But you would feel uncomfortable with more racial behavior.
No, so I would say the following. So first of all, again, it is not that when the city operates, it can operate in any way which is discriminatory, racist, etc. So if we think about various constitutional prohibitions, they obviously, anyway, regardless of autonomy or of solidarity, they would simply apply everywhere. Okay, so the constitutional mandate of no racism or equality, at least as such, would apply. It is true that I think that a little bit like in the European Union, in the sense of a certain area of capability, like of the various member states, the different member states can balance the different constitutional values differently, but it doesn't mean that they can discard certain constitutional prohibitions or principles altogether.
So just to push you a little further, if under the Constitution there is a separation between state and church, would or should local autonomy, can they deviate from that separation? Or is it a constitutional right that they must maintain, such as non-discriminatory?
Well, if you had such a complete ban on any form of recognizing, religion, etc., I actually know of very, even in France, it is not even, laïque France has various abilities, definitely Germany and many other countries that do not have such a strict separation between church and state. You have Sunday laws in most countries that I know, and of course there are ways to go about it. But sure, if you had a strict separation where you couldn't even do accommodation for religion, then you might be right that you couldn't do it. Definitely, it's not the case in Israel.
So to conclude, it's local autonomy under the Constitution.
Yes, it is local autonomy under. This is why it's not sovereignty. Okay, so if it were sovereign states, then even the Constitution wouldn't apply.
Okay. So Katya was asking before, but I know you have follow-ups. So the question is, can you remember them for a few minutes longer? So be quick.
The case of Afula specifically went to the High Supreme Court. It was surpassed in seconds. There was no question about it, and just to.
It was an easy case.
It was a very easy case, no questions asked.
Right.
Of course.
You need a Supreme.
Of course.
Supreme Court still. If it's actually, I think that we still need a Supreme Court, and the Constitution would still apply.
Constitution.
In order not to talk about the Supreme Court for one day.
Well, we should talk about it every day, all the days. That's the only way we can protect it. So, Katya, please.
Thank you very much. Really, three wonderful, illuminating presentations. I would like to follow up on what Avner just said and Ishai's answer, but my first question will be to Nofar. It's about, I want to connect to this idea of a local authority which is not showing solidarity to one of the groups that are living in the city. So this is obviously the case in Jerusalem.
A nice way of.
Yeah. Okay, to generalize. So, and in this case, the local authority, the Jerusalem municipality, also does not do anything about culture in West Jerusalem. Not only it, does very little. So my question is if it is actually good, because should they do some projects and they would control this area and the artistic expression much more than it is now. My question is if this void is something that allows allows art, culture to flourish a little bit in a way. Maybe I don't know if it's such a good comparison. In Russia, after the revolution, there were about 5 years without very specific regulation, and this was after the war, after the civil war, and this was also 20s, more or less, and this was a period of cultural flourishing, artistic flourishing. So, just as a way of comparison, if this void is something enabling, in your view, or not. So maybe I will ask my second question as well, and then I'll let you talk. So the second question is to Ishai and Stefan together. So it connects to what Talia said about conflicts between the local government and the state government. Also a little bit about constitutionalism. What do you think should happen if there is some inherent conflict between the locality, the city, and the state? The best examples are, of course, Gaza and Golan, what Ishai was talking about, because these are places that were about to be given back where they belong. So this would mean that they do no longer belong to Israel, and these municipalities would no longer exist. So this is a very existential conflict. It is clear that the municipalities have a very strong interest to protect themselves, and this might run against the interest of the state. If there should be something that forbids them from taking an action, in this case, also note that other municipalities cannot do something similar. If, for example, Tel Aviv cannot do something like, let's get rid of Golan Heights or something like that, a counter campaign, because Tel Aviv does not have any local interest in giving up territory which is outside of Tel Aviv. And as Ishai said, our democratic right is not only to elect our general representatives on the state level, but also our local representatives. But democracy is also about yielding to what majority wants. So if the majority and my locality are in such a conflict, what should be the solution? For Vienna, it is, of course, imaginary. But imagine that there could be something like, for example, Vienna would be the only city in Austria that has enough beds in hospitals for COVID patients. So it could have not as strict restrictions as the other areas in Austria, but of course this would affect the other areas as well. Okay.
So I think that I don't think it's not good to enable by not doing anything. I don't think that's the solution. Okay, I think the municipality needs to invest in arts and culture in East Jerusalem, but I think the question is, of course, how to do it. If they're just going to come and enforce, one particular model or mandate how resources are going to be used and where and how, then of course that's not a good thing to do. But I think that the municipality has shown that there are sometimes flexible, creative solutions that they can do to find compromises to still fund organizations, but maybe let go of the way they usually do it. So I think ultimately if organizations in East Jerusalem decide not to work with the municipality, it's their choice, they're fully entitled to do it. But I don't think the solution is for the municipality to say, okay, we're just going to give up. These are residents, taxpayers who deserve to have services in the city like any other resident. If you take, for example, so in recent years, the government actually has decided to invest in East Jerusalem, all the 5-year plans that they're going to come. They're saying, okay, we're going to invest millions of shekels to try to reduce the gaps. But the way they do it is not a very constructive way often, because they often precondition it. So for example, they're going to say, okay, we're going to fund schools, but we're only going to fund schools if we're going to use the Israeli curriculum. So we're not going to fund you otherwise. So that's a really problematic model of providing resources. So of course, that's not the way to do it. But if they can find compromises and solutions and creative solutions and to work with the residents and with the organizations, then I think it's definitely better than what's going on nowadays, which is, they get nothing and they deserve to have resources and access to them.
Can I add? Just a very small point to this, that I think we need to remember that we're discussing this from the art organizations or institutions point of view that work in East Jerusalem. But the artists themselves, if they can not work in East Jerusalem, they won't work there. I mean, as an artist, you don't have a future in East Jerusalem. You would go to either Ramallah, if you're Palestinian, or if you have an Israeli citizenship, you will go to Haifa, to Jaffa. In order for the art scene to flourish, you need a lot of agents there. And East Jerusalem doesn't have that. As such, and that's why we think also that the organizations are interesting to look at, but they now cater to a very specific situation in time, which will not change in the near future. So.
Stefan, you want to start?
You're kind of pushing me out of my zone of professional expertise a bit, I must say, but I will try to give an answer to the question. First of all, the case, the fictional case you just mentioned about Vienna was not fictional. Yeah, Vienna actually, we had so many capacities that half of the eastern part of Austria went to Vienna to have medical treatment, and it was totally okay. It just happened. Because people could go there to the hospital coming from any other province. First answer. Second answer, we have a legal framework, a constitutional framework, of course, that regulates all kinds of these issues. So there is a formal answer. But the funny thing is, in the pandemic, and this wasn't a new law, this was a very old law, but it never became relevant. In case of a pandemic, the Federal Minister of Health can give orders to municipalities, for example, or to province governments. And he could have done so, but he did not. Because his point would be clueless. I can give orders, but whether they do it or not, if they don't like it, they will do it in a way that's not effective in the way I intended it. So he didn't do it. He was going for compromise. He negotiated with the governments. And then it became affected. So interesting thing is there is a lot of factual power actually involved. Yeah, that's my brief answer. I hope it is.
I just want to make 3 quick points. The first is, even though I was pushed to talk about the Supreme Court, I actually want to make the important point which Einat started with when she presented the project, which I understand that when we think about rights or about various interests of minorities and other groups, we think through the framework of rights and then we think about courts. But I think that what we often forget is the institutional part. And here, together with other institutions which aren't courts, cities are institutions, legal, social, etc., that can protect rights no less than other institutions. And as long as we constantly just think about Supreme Courts, we're going to fail. And what is unique about cities, again, without falling into the local trap that Nir mentioned, without just romanticizing cities, and without forgetting the downsides of them, then they are no less effective in protecting various minorities and in protecting various other interests that we have. So that is the first point. The second is what happened when there's an inherent tension between the local and etc. So again, the test that Katya was mentioning, and I think that it's an important test that the court develops, is the unique and separate interest that localities have. And then it means that even if we're not at the existential crisis of really like, getting rid of the Golan Heights, etc., think about coastal cities and climate change. So states might not do anything, but cities that are at coastal lines have a separate and unique interest to actually operate even against the policies of their governments. So if you kind of think more thoroughly about this idea of the separate and unique interest vis-a-vis the state, then we can also find the location where cities can operate. And it can also be, if they're, let's say, more at the forefront of confronting immigration or asylum seekers, etc., you can think this would actually mean that they have a special interest in operating. Okay, is that enough?
You had a question there.
Thank you. I have a question for Stefan that I cannot understand the difference of you call collaborative governance if it is different from strategic planning.
What was the first term?
Collaborative governance. Is it different from strategic planning?
Martin Kornberger, my co-author in this, actually wrote a book and several articles in newspapers, and his key argument was the big difference that might be what you're asking me is that it's actually strategy without having a plan, because you can't have a plan if everything is in flux, highly dynamic. I mean, strategic planning, the idea is, as we teach it, right? You plan and you make goals, and do you go for the goals and then check, right? So it's a different kind of planning. That would be my first figure of thought that I presented. I would say that's a big difference.
Well, but when I read your presentation, it was not clear for me if it was one thing or another, because in your scheme was very, very similar to what is an strategic planning. Then, second, all you are discussing about local autonomy, I think in Europe it is solved in what we call multi-level governance. Where is the autonomy of a neighborhood? The limit of the district. What is the autonomy of the district? The limit of the city, etc. Till arriving to Brussels.
This is subsidiarity.
Yeah.
So maybe just quickly, I mean, you're now pronouncing the principle of subsidiarity, which is obviously a principle that is about multi-level governance, and I would say that that it is in opposition to the notion of federalism. So while federalism kind of views various elements as black boxes that we don't see through, and we let the state, for example, decide whatever it wants about its internal structure, whether it recognizes neighborhoods or cities or regions, etc. The principle of subsidiarity, which we know comes from Catholic dogma, but also from economic thinking, kind of thinks constantly on all elements of government, piercing through the various autonomies that we might have, and kind of, again, either through a theology or through a calculation of the optimal size of governance, picking up the element of government that would control the, again, kind of either population or any good. So yes, but I don't think that it means that it has been resolved. I think that there are still tensions between the you could say the centrifugal and the centripetal, or the inward and outward.
I think that really concludes the session. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next, in 15 minutes.